One. Thank you, committee. Thank you all. Thank you to Josh and Sarah for being here. And I assume David Hall is out there on Zoom at some point as well. We're going to be talking about S79 and the veto and what our next steps might be. I want to start off with Josh. Both Jerry Garcia, what a long, strange trip this has been. I would like to hear from the administration their perspective on the bill we passed. If there's any more information you could share with us that would help us outside the four corners of the veto message. I've had some communication myself with the administration, but I'd like to know the latest. Josh, if you could help us.
Sure. Thank you. And good afternoon, committee. Josh Hanford, Commissioner of Housing and Community Development. As you know, the governor laid out his concerns in the veto message, and I know there's been some conversations discussing some details there. And in the big picture, I think it boils down to a concern that the governor has about mom and pop owners of rental property, short-term and long-term, that the bill that was vetoed would add bureaucracy to those owners of small properties that would perhaps make it less likely for them to continue on with that and could be affected by the outcomes. I think there's some agreement around some fixes that sort of take away the discretion given to public safety about shutting down a unit as opposed to leaving it open and asking them to address the concerns, as well as some of the expanded sort of complaint-based expanding into a mandatory statewide inspection authority of Department of Fire Safety. But the biggest challenge seems to be on the short-term rentals and how we're going to address that, and the major disagreement there. Frankly, in conversation I had with the governor yesterday, he feels our priority should be, and I agree, and this is all of us, that we should be focusing all of our time and attention on building more housing units, getting more housing units online, exiting people from homelessness. And that's priority number one, that we should have all of our committees of jurisdiction and everyone on the same page addressing that, and that, a rental registry process over the next 6 months, or if we would have had to implement it this past summer, would stand in the way of some of those efforts that are absolutely critical. I hope we can talk about what has happened with VHIP, what we hope should continue with that, and that the reality that those units that get investments come with requirements to serve low-income people, to serve people exiting homelessness, and are on the radar, if you will, registered by nonprofit housing groups monitoring them, and that is the way we're going to address our housing crisis over the next year or two that continues to get worse, and that anything that pulls our attention away from that immediate crisis is not something that is of the highest priority in this next session.
Josh, have you given any thought to the variables that might exist within the mom and pop concern that the governor has? I mean, it might be something like delayed implementation, or part of the registry, but not necessarily part of the inspection program, or vice versa, or it might be limited to in-home rentals. I mean, I personally have less concern if the rental is being done by a family person who's living in the larger unit, accessory dwelling right there. I mean, there's a lot of variables to massage this area. I'm wondering if you have made a list or can think of a lot of things that we could have further discussion on, as opposed to blanket, you know, first 4 units are not covered or something like that, even if the person's out of state, you know.
Right. I think the governor's message definitely opens that door with his sort of 2 units or more, view that once someone owns that many units, they're really engaged in a business activity, and that's the starting point for this discussion. I think that part of our challenge is there's a lot of partners and advocates and folks that need to be involved in this discussion, and to get people on the same page. That's been 5-10 years that we've been at this, and that's not something that I'm going to be able to be as engaged in as in the past few years, with the direction and the severe housing crisis and what we're involved in hundreds of millions of dollars in responsibility that is, frankly, consumed my very small housing division, and will be for the next few years. That's a reality that is, it's right before us, and it's not changing. So I, am concerned about how those discussions and negotiations and how you get people to that same place, coming from our small team that once had the time to work on this and be deeply engaged, have been completely off the rails onto other tasks, and will be, to be frank.
Well, so I have a little bit of a problem with that our administrative, that our lack of enough people in administration would affect people's safety and people's safe housing and healthy housing. That to me is something we can easily fix and can be with this new budget. And you should certainly, for the next several years, be adding people to help you administer the growth in housing. But to shortchange Vermonters because of an administrative shortfall in numbers of people, it seems to me just irresponsible for the state to go on that, to justify not protecting Vermonters. To me, that's an inadequate response. I'm sorry. I have a real problem with that.
I would say it's just the opposite, Senator Clarkson, that our efforts need to be focused on the folks that are currently unhoused, they're homeless, and that we have dollars to move and put out into play and solutions for those problems. That folks that this rental registry may help down the road in a year or two, doesn't seem to be the same. I don't think the urgency is quite the same on that effort, and that this is what's before us. We have, the governor just put a pause, extended the GA for another month. We have a cold winter coming. We still have hundreds of millions of dollars of housing money to put out, and we have added 2 temporary staff to assist with those programs. There's more coming. But the staffing shortages are not all on our own making. We can't get enough people to apply for these positions to do this work right now. In addition, the sort of internal capacity to build a new IT program is clearly complicated as well. So those are just the realities of where we are now from where we started this discussion, over a year ago.
I would, just before Senator Rahm goes, I would say there's urgency in opportunity, and the opportunity is now.
Yep.
Politically.
Commissioner, I'm glad you brought up the GA Motel Assistance Program and the crisis of homelessness in the state. We came dangerously close to asking 500 plus Vermonters to go back out into the cold from a motel where they were finally able to gain stability. And we're going to be close to that situation again as the next month comes to a close. What's your plan to make sure that we avert a crisis and don't have homeless Vermonters who are seeking to be housed within a month?
Well, my plan is to build more units, and we've done that successfully with VHIP, 249 units. We have another 140 that are going to be underway soon with the 5 million of ARPA money that was allocated to us. We plan to propose a significant expansion of that to continue to rapidly provide housing for those that are homeless. That is the number one thing we can do. I can't speak for the governor, what he's going to do after this 30 days and what AHS is doing, but we've had numerous meetings, numerous meetings a week that we inventory what housing is being built, what's coming online, and how rapidly, folks are being able to be transitioned out of the precarious situation they're in. And that is job number one, focus number one, and what we should all be primarily focused on. With the resources we have, the governor reminded again, we asked for 250 million of ARPA for housing last year. We ended up with 75 million going to housing, 5 million for VHIP and 70 going to VHCB. There were other funds that were one-time general funds that went to VHCB to build housing, but we have a lot of room in the ARPA funding, which is clearly one of the most eligible activities, is to provide rapid housing for the homeless. And we have, as you said, Senator, hundreds of families still homeless that we need to signal to the development community, this money is not running out. We're doubling down, we're providing more money because we already can see what we have in play is going to run out. And we have developments that have yet to do their preliminary engineering and pre-development work that need signals that there's more coming to continue some of these projects that are in the works. That's the only way we're going to get out of this housing crisis and folks that are homeless, is to provide more affordable housing and to build it despite the challenges with supply chain, labor shortage, and increasing costs. Communities are recognizing they share in this burden, and we need to do more. And we need to signal that we're all in with more money to do this. And not wait for whatever's coming out of additional funding from DC. We have the ARPA dollars right now to continue this and to send a strong signal. And I'm hoping in day one of the legislative session, we can all be on the same page with that, and we can agree to more money within the first few weeks and keep this train rolling. Otherwise, we're going to have a massive pause in what we can expect for development in the pipeline.
So Josh, we have the money. I think our total housing was 191 million, more than we've ever spent on housing. And I think we're all on the same page that housing is one of our primary needs, both for the homeless and for thousands of Vermonters who need affordable housing. As you know, we have been strong advocates for that. So, you're preaching to the converted here. The concern I have is we have, as we all know, a lot of money. How are you actually doing on the workforce and the materials to actually get it built? And I'd love to have you run over those VHIP numbers again, because VHIP was, of course, embedded in this bill. The money, of course, was passed in the budget. So you got the money, but not the language for the program setup. How many, can you just give us an update on what's happened with VHIP and the number of other units that have been built independent of VHIP?
Sure. So the first place we started with VHIP was the CRF funded VHIP program, which we received 7.6 million. And we've built through 239 units that are occupied. There's another 10 that are finishing by November 30th. So 249 total units will be the result of that. We had an extension. You remember last year, it all played out to the very 11th hour. We were able to continue some projects and add more. And I will say, since last summer or last spring, when we got the extension, every new unit of VHIP is required to serve someone exiting homelessness. We started the program with sort of like a a 3-tiered approach that we preferred you to serve someone homeless, but you had these different choices. The last batch of units is all required to serve the homeless. So out of that 240, a little over a third are directly serving the homeless. The next 5 million that was appropriated of ARPA funds for VHIP, we followed the policy language in S79 around how to use those funds for VHIP, even though the bill was vetoed. But we took the approach that number one priority should be serving the homeless, even though that was one of 2 choices in the policy language. So we put the word out to our housing providers, our homeownership centers, to ask them to start a waiting list and to only select people that would guarantee these units serve the homeless. So that's what they've done. We already have approximately 140 units that are that are in a pipeline. The grant agreements haven't gone out to those owners yet. We are still waiting for final clearance on those ARPA funds, but we're finishing up the last 10 from the first batch. So we anticipate those 140 to be, starting construction in the next month or 2 and play out, all dedicated to serving the homeless. What else was I going to say on that? So that's just a small number of the housing units that were built. VHCB received the lion's share of housing development dollars. And through 2020, the total number of units that were created, including 200 that are dedicated to VHIP, was 551 units were created and fully occupied. 311 were for dedicated for the homeless. To date, in 2021, we've created 163 units of new housing with 30 dedicated to the homeless. VHIP numbers are included in that. And by the end of 2021, we expect another 65 units to come online with 22 dedicated to the homeless. And then we get into projections for 22 and 23, which we have pretty good projections because we have projects that are applying that have already received development dollars from VHCB and other sources. And we're looking at about 471 units coming online in 2022. And then from there out, it sort of gets a little murky, but 300 plus at least already in the pipeline. So what we're estimating is over 1,547 units of housing is in the pipeline to be completed by 2023, with 745 dedicated to the homeless. What you can see there is these are unheard of affordable housing development numbers. Typically, we fund about 300 in any given year at the max. And we're funding 700-800 a year. But it's not going to meet the number of folks that are currently homeless right now in motels. We need more money, more time, and more resources, even outside the box proposals. One of the issues that has come up is we've successfully housed some people, even in VHIP units, and those tenancies have turned out to be unsuccessful. Someone it hasn't worked. The property has been once again left in shambles, and those units need to be rehabbed again. We have situations where folks were in an apartment and the eviction moratorium was going on for 1.5 years, and then someone moved out. They weren't evicted, but they moved out. Those landlords have not been eligible for any of the hundreds of millions of dollars of rental assistance because it has to go with a tenant applicant that has not been evicted or is not left. So they voluntarily vacated the unit. The landlord is left with $10,000, $12,000 in losses and an apartment that can't be re-rent. They're not eligible for any of these programs. We need to propose some sort of loan loss reserve fund, rent risk pool fund going into the next year to get those units back online, to get those property owners in a position where they can re-rent again. Is some other solutions, in addition to filling vacant mobile home park lots with mobile homes we can buy and rent to folks exiting homeless. There's so many different solutions that I'm not the only voice here on this. There's lots of other housing players working on this, but the scope is, the solutions are many and the problem is, great.
Yes, the problem is 10,000 units tomorrow would be great and be all snapped up.
And as we're going through this, the housing market is shifting daily. Everything is, more expensive, less availability. The one bit of good news is the residential building permits have increased 50% year over year. A lot of those are market rate people that are building on their own, but that is a good sign that the market is starting to respond to the undersupply, the 4 decades worth of undersupply of housing in Vermont.
So Josh, could you brainstorm with your people under what you call the mom and pop issue that the governor focused on, especially as it applies to short-term rentals, and come up with variables? I mean, you're not new to the legislative process. There are plenty of ways to get to the goal. It may take a little bit longer. There are certain factors of size and rental periods and, degree of relationships and ownership. It's just a many different ways that could lead to getting to
Yes.
yes. I think the governor was pretty clear that he thought the differences were not great and he thought consensus could be reached. So I'd like, if you can, I mean, I actually think it could be a fairly long list if you think about creative ways to maybe go somewhat softer on the mom and pops, but not necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, I mean, we need inspections
Yes.
for most rental units unless they're very unlikely to have problems or they're so infrequently rented or whatever. So those are all kinds of factors that we'd like to start talking about. So when we come in January, we can move fast. I mean, the choices are pretty obvious. We can either try for a veto override. That's not certain, but as I've expressed, if we could go in arm in arm with the governor on a bill that we can support, that bill could almost be on his desk as quickly as we could override a veto. And why have the fight over the next 4 months? I agree with them. I don't think the differences are great. So,
But yeah, the differences aren't great. And I wish some of those concerns had been raised while we could have actually dealt with them. I'm not sure we had heard from mom and pops. I mean, we could have, I think if we're talking about residential owners that are living in units where they have one carved out apartment or an ADU with a full-time residential owner living in one of them. I mean, these are things we could have addressed easily. It continues to be frustrating that we got to that abyss without getting the opportunity to resolve those differences, which were pretty modest.
I completely understand that. Trust me, I was there as well, and the rate at which things were moving. And, to be fair to your committee, there was a lot that moved in the House at the end on some of the fire safety concerns that didn't have their legal counsel or others weigh in on, that I think are some of these technical concerns that could have maybe been fixed even then, but things were just happening so fast. I see Sarah has her hand up, and on your request, Senator Sorokin, I'm going to have to ask the Rental Advisory Board, the players, legal aid, and others that have interest in this to be ones that craft what they would be willing to support as well on this for a change. Because Sean Gilpin is fully engaged on the rental assistance program. The resources to organize and do that same work have diminished. That's the honest truth. And so we're going to need to ask the partners to present us with some of the what they would accept from the governor's ask to sort of shrink some of this pool to address the mom and pops as what they would be willing to accept, so we can start to get to this compromise. There was a lot of us working to get to that place before with the partners. And so, maybe Sarah was going to present some of that information.
Okay, so everybody has told me now that Sarah has her hand up. You're in a very little box there.
Yeah,
It's hard for
Sarah,
me
I
to
think-
see. It might
Yeah,
be,
that would be great because we can't see her at all.
it might be time to hear from Sarah, and David Hall's with us. Want to talk with David briefly too.
Okay, thank you, committee. Sarah Carpenter, Chair of the Rental Housing Advisory Board. I just want to warn you, I really do need to scoot out at 1:45, and there's a lot going on here, but I want us to step back a minute because, and I certainly can work offline with Josh and others, but I'm getting some confusing messages. Because we don't have a registry, we have absolutely no idea how many sort of mom and pop, which we should define, landlords there are versus others. So the owning of a duplex isn't a definition of a mom and pop. I can tell you 5 or 10 people in the city of Burlington that own dozens of duplexes. So, and to understand that 45% of our rental housing are 1 and 2 family homes, because that's what the state of Vermont has. I mean, I will tell you, almost a quarter of our rental stock are single family homes, and that's some of our worst housing. Old dilapidated houses that have been sitting around for years that are rented. So I just want to get the context that 1 unit, 2 units can't necessarily be the defining factor. And having said that, they are all currently covered under landlord tenant, health inspection, and fire safety. So there is no new regulation of those homes. We didn't add a stick of regulation. We simply transferred it from 2 agencies into 1. And I don't need to belabor that, but so we're getting these mixed messages. And what's confusing within it is, what are the concerns about short-term rentals? The rehab board went into this really focused on long-term rentals. That's somebody's home, they live there most of the time, they need some consumer protection. But we are quite aware that there are property owners who jump back and forth, either depending on the season or the community they live in. So it seemed reasonable that you want to register them all at one time, not make them do 2 registries as opposed to 1 registry. So I need clarification on the governor's, what group is he most concerned about? Because I can't get that out of his letter. For example, he talks about S79 would cover almost all rental types. Well, they're already covered by landlord tenant law and fire safety and health code. That's not new coverage. But within it, who would you want exempted from registration? We did provide some owner occupied exemptions in S79, so those could be looked at. And there may be more room on the owner occupancy side, but understanding that under current law, owner occupied units still have to meet the codes. So the codes haven't changed. So I guess I'm wanting Josh or the governor's office to sort of help narrow down what pool is it that you're nervous about, and in what rental venue? Is it long-term or short-term?
So Sarah, I can understand your confusion. We're not going to resolve that, nor is it the purpose of this hearing to get into the merits of any exemptions here. I just want brainstorming out there to go on between the 2 of you and others. And as Josh puts together his list, I think it'll become more evident what he's looking for and what the flaws in what he's looking for. We're not saying we're agreeing to anything. I'm not willing to go backwards on anything. But that when you talk about, there is a distinction when you say the code applies to all housing already. Well, we're changing the enforcement of that to a much better agency. So that's a change. And if the governor's concerned about, even though the law's on the book, it's not being enforced, and he still doesn't want it to be enforced, I don't agree with him, but he has a right to say that it's a change in practice. And so we need to find out what he's after. We're not going backwards on anything. We're just going to go forward, but we may not be able to go forward as much as S79 went if we want him to sign it. Yes.
Let me just add that I think there's a more fundamental question involved. That more fundamental question is whether or not there can be, or ought to be, or could be a complaint-driven system as opposed to a system driven by massive registration and the bureaucracy that would entail. We have a complaint-driven system theoretically right now. And one of the problems, at least, that was identified was that in some towns, the local health officer solution was not working because those people were not doing what they theoretically were supposed to do. So the question is, it's not, in my mind, a middle ground between exempting certain buildings from a massive registration system or determining whether that registration system is required at all and whether or not a complaint-driven system would accomplish what we need to accomplish.
Well, I, for one, am a little confused by that because I don't think, if you're saying we were trying to move to a periodic inspection program through this bill, that was not my understanding.
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
It's not what I'm saying.
It's not, that's not what was.
It's still complaint driven.
It's still complaint driven. It always has been.
Right.
It's just a different
But
agency
whether or
will
not
be
that
taking a
degree
complaint.
of registration is necessary to do that in a complaint-driven system as opposed to someone who has a complaint picking up a telephone. That connection between creating a registration system for every single property in Vermont is necessary for a complaint-driven system for someone who finds that they have a fire hazard in their home.
I think
That's not necessary.
I think there are, Josh or Sarah could probably talk to this, but I think there are other reasons beyond inspections to have a registry. It's not the nose under the camel's tent.
Right.
I mean, I would argue, first of all, we have some of that now. It's just very uncoordinated. And so it would be coordinating that. I mean, Josh was talking about the need to let property owners know about VHIP. We don't know how to communicate with them. The emergency rental program is still significantly underutilized.
Right.
We have no way to communicate with landlords. Part of this was precipitated by Irene. We had no way to communicate with property owners at that time. And we already had, I mean, everybody who owns a house built pre-1978 because of the lead exposure is supposed to register, but we don't know where they are, so we can't enforce the lead laws. So it was intended to put in one spot this info that's sort of floating around already in a much more coordinated. And I do want to, as a sidebar, I appreciate how busy Josh is, and we got to get the building money out the door, but buying an IT consultant in the scheme of life to fix this doesn't seem so overwhelming. And maybe we need more money in the small 100,000 that we asked for to make it less burdensome on DHCD. But really the goal is to get the data into one spot. We have multiple conversations about mom and pop landlords. We don't know who owns the property. We don't even know where it is, and therefore we don't even know who owns it. And that's every other business. You know, the short-term rentals actually are a little more taken care of because they already register with the tax department. So from our perspective, asking them to do a rental registry didn't seem any more burdensome than registering with the tax department, which is probably much more complicated. So it's intended to be a really quite a straightforward registry. It's not cumbersome.
Right.
So just let me say that we have another hearing scheduled for the 12th, and I hope between now and then we'll put you back on the schedule, that you could come up with at least some parameters for variables that we could look at to make this issue go smoothly. I'm not saying we're going to agree, but that's, I think, a good starting point to start thinking about. And we'd have a better idea, I think, once we start talking about those, what objections the governor has that make sense, which ones don't, which ones he's serious about, and see if we can work it out. Sarah?
Just to underscore what Sarah was saying about defining a mom and pop or a small landlord, Commissioner, I'm really sympathetic to the idea that some small landlords aren't eligible for anything, don't know how to raise their hand and ask for help. I can't see us giving money to that group without defining who they are and having a sense of how many there are and how much of an impact we're having when we get money out the door. And I can't see any other way to do that than a registry. If we have no sense of who otherwise qualifies as a mom and pop, then it sounds like it's the kind of people who just know how to talk to their legislator, know how to talk to the governor or to the commissioner. And, that's sort of back to square one with a lot of inequity issues we've been having, is that it's really unfair to just go for the loudest voices or the most connected landlords. So I can't see anything but a registry to achieve what you want to achieve with actually helping to fund the small landlords who've been left behind.
I guess my response to that would be that the small landlords that are getting assistance today, are going through an application process. They're saying they have a vacant unit. They're willing to serve a homeless person. They're matching it, and they're being provided oversight and underwriting by nonprofit housing providers. So those are clear. We know who those are. What I am hearing and what the governor is hearing from some folks, particularly in some of the short-term rentals where they own one small property, is that they feel that this added registration, possible inspection, and burden is going to make them do something different with that property. Perhaps sell it to some of the national firms that are buying up dozens of these and running it as a motel. What's interesting about this last bill is the largest landlords and the largest owners of short-term rentals were completely in support of it. That is true. The industry supports this. It's those that aren't represented by the Landlords Association, the Short-Term Rental Alliance, and others that spoke to their representatives and made concerns about this. And that I think what the governor is saying is those mom and pop, average Jane or Joe that owns their family owns a second camp, that they are going to look at this as a burden and just throw up their hands and sell it for someone else to operate as professional, property owner. I don't think that the lack of having this rental registry is any way preventing us from getting more units online. There are plenty of vacant properties that are and owners that are willing to serve low-income people, folks exiting homelessness, in exchange for getting help to get those units back online, getting a new furnace, fixing the weatherization problems at a modest price, under average of $23,000 to serve someone for at least 5 years. And this registry is not getting in the way of that. There are a lot of nuances here. I can go back and see what efforts we can put on the table about these nuances here. But I also need to express to the Rental Advisory Housing Board, the other advocates, that them coming with where they would move towards this is going to be key for us to sort of put effort behind this, because the governor has made it clear to me his number one priority is to get more units online, VHIP, not stand up a rental registry, not hire an additional staff person to do that. We have 6 open positions to move the $150 million we have. right now that this would be in addition to that, competing for that time, that space, and those critical efforts under this coming year. So that's the reality. I know it's not what the committee wants to hear. A lot has changed in 2 years about where this sort of ranks in DHCD's priorities, and that's where we are.
Can I just get clarity on the 6 open positions?
Yeah.
I didn't understand that. Are there 6 positions that aren't filled, or you just
Right.
put them out
So
there?
ARPA, the ARPA funding allowed a number of temporary positions to be filled to help us move these hundreds of millions of dollars. And we have only filled 1 of the 6 to date. We are struggling with finding people. It looks like we're onboarding someone in the next couple weeks that we are able to. It's literally competition. We used to get 10, 20 applications for these positions because they're only temporary, but they're still a foot in the door for the state. And we're seeing 1 or 2 applicants apply for these positions.
Sarah has her hand up. Sarah has her.
I just want to, there's a lot of ways to attack this, but there are many, many reasons for the need for the registry, including data. But one of them, which was presented to us, was an ongoing funding source for professional inspectors. You
Right.
just can't use volunteers anymore, and it isn't working. We could front load that program on the code inspection and backload the registry. I mean, there are ways to approach it. It simply would cost more money in year 1. And that was in fact a proposal we had several years ago, and we were told to go back to the drawing board, make it fee-based day 1. But we can redraw that if that's the desire of this committee, and stretch out the registry and focus on the fire safety transfer, which I think is the most important part of this conversation. So I just want to reiterate too, and again, I can take this offline with Josh, we've got to wrap our head around the difference between the effect on a short-term rental owner and a long-term. They're just different. And we keep throwing them in the same bucket, and they're not in the same bucket. So I think that's just an important component.
Well, Sarah, they're in the same bucket in that they are renting to the public.
Yes, and the public should be protected.
And the public should be protected.
Yeah.
And Josh, with all due respect, I think that Vermont can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think that we're perfectly capable with the money that we have, and you will find the staff to do both things. There is, we are a capable group of people, and we have the will to build the housing. We have the money to build the housing. We also need to be We also need to protect the people who are in the housing.
I think, maybe I'm dreaming this, Josh, but I find the testimony a little of concern, because I can almost see you testifying in my committee about how it was so important to the Commissioner of Housing to know where all these units were in the state of Vermont at one time. And now you're saying that it's not all that important.
Well, Senator, with all due respect, you're asking me to bargain, to broker a compromise on this, find a solution. And I'm telling you that this is not the governor's top priority. I have other priorities that are my top priority. So I think if folks can find and address those concerns that the governor's laid out, there is an opposition. But what I'm trying to tell you is that my attention to this is not, I'm not able to give the same attention as I was 2 years ago. I hope you understand.
So you're saying you don't want to meet with these people and see if you can find solutions to this?
I'm saying there's a diverse group of folks that have lots of interest in this, that if they can come to where the governor is, we'd be happy to continue to work on this. But I don't think that's not something that I'm just going to squeeze in one meeting. That's going to be a body of work, and that there has to be agreement, which I'm not hearing. And this is an initial conversation with this, but we need to talk with the Rental Housing Advisory Board and lots of others. And I am just concerned of the bandwidth to get that done, and knowing that this isn't my greatest priority at the time.
Is there somebody else in the agency that can take this on?
I mean,
It was Sean Gilpin. He's now managing hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that the scenario is just changed.
Well, it sounds like it's changed from my meeting a week ago, but
Sarah's got her hand up again.
yes,
I mean, I got a whole city to run too, but no. I think in half a day, I still am confused about the concerns. So I'm saying this directly to Josh. I can sit with you and we can bring a couple people to the table and let's understand the concerns, because I can't offer a solution to something I'm less than clear about the concern of. So that's what I need right in the short run. I think we can go back to the drawing table and look at, different options to get that. But we need from either you, Josh, or somebody else in the governor's office, I'd like to go through and say, what about that line is concerning you? Because I think there was also some misinterpretation around, things got harried at the end. And I know,
Yeah, I think there's those technical fixes that, Department of Fire Safety disagrees that this is their duty is to inspect these units if this happens. Now, they can choose to only do it on a complaint-based basis, but they could also be in legal jeopardy there for not having a plan to inspect every unit, which they're not going to be able to do if they absorb all of these short-term rentals. There's some nuances there that it is not for me that's for the legal counsel to work out, which was never brought in on the House side at the end of the day to hear fire and safety's legal counsel concerns on this. Under the units, the governor was clear, 2 units or more. Yes, he's willing to go through this registration inspection process. And, I'm hearing that that's not going to work because so many units, so many people just own one property. I don't think it was a duplex or one house. I think it's the owner. If someone owns more than 2 rental units, whether they're short-term or long-term, they should have some additional scrutiny, registration. That's what the governor's saying. And that seems to be.
So that's a clarification. That's helpful.
Yeah, that's what the, 2 units or more as a property owner, to not squeeze out the Vermont, resident that just happens to own a family camp that they lease out, that this registration is going to be an added burden, and they're really not in the professional renting business at all. It's just covering their property taxes, and they're sharing it with family and friends, and that this level of increased, redesign of this property, this process is a big body of work, and adding the short-term rentals last year really significantly changed this.
Josh, should I say the statement, and this is a huge clarification, that if he's only talking about owners of 1 or 2 units as opposed to a unit of 1 or 2, that's a big difference. And the sentence doesn't say that. So that's the kind of thing I think we just need to clarify. If you're talking about owners of, I don't know, that's the kind of thing we need to clarify.
Can I just jump in here, Josh? Sorry. Nice to see you, Sarah. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean there, just so that I can wrap my head around that distinction you're making?
The distinction I'm making is, someone that owns 2 or more rental properties, they are running a business that they should keep up with all of the rules, the regulations. They should be much more aware of their obligations. Someone that just happens to have 1 property that they're renting, or 2 in this tour, they're this added registration fee, possible inspection for a complaint could put them over the edge of wanting to do this anymore. They sell this property, especially in the short-term rental area. A lot of these properties are being bought up by out-of-state investment companies that are, finding a way around being licensed lodging properties. And in the governor's view, this is going to further that. I'm going to feel like I'm having more compliance, more oversight. I was just trying to rent this out once in a while to help pay the property taxes. Now I'm being punished for doing that. And so that's that mom and pop idea that this registration fee, increased inspection sort of likelihood is something the governor's willing to approach for someone that owns more than 2 properties and rents them.
There is no increased inspection. I mean, that was not a piece of it.
Well, there could be, if fire safety, that's a disagreement on the legal side, legal counsel, that fire safety has the duty to inspect once they take on this role. We've all talked about it being complaint-based only, but there's been legal opinions that differ from that in the governor's office. And that was never.
I think you started off on a good note by saying what I understand the situation to be. Is there are technical legal readings of both complaint-based and unlimited fining and shutting down that in the theoretical extreme could happen. That was never our intent. And I think the lawyers need to get together to make sure that if there is this technical argument that we put that to bed. I think that's the way you started your testimony, and I appreciated that. And that's the direction I think we're willing to go. I've talked to our legal counsel, and he's going to maybe testify next. And he said, it was never testified that way. He doesn't see it happening that way in the real world. But if people need a level of comfort to make sure that it can't happen, then it's not going to upset the bill, because that was never our intent. So I think we need to focus more on the exemptions and to see if we can get to yes. One of the things that I talked about with the governor's office at one point was, maybe in terms of if there is an inspection. I mean, and you talked about, well, what if they rent out very rarely, periodically, yada, yada, yada. I mean, legislation can be crafted to treat smaller units differently as opposed to totally exempting them. So you could, for instance, waive a fee. You can say the first notice of any violation has to go out with a 6-month warning to repair, giving people a lot of time to fix things. There's so many ways you can soften the impact on the people you're talking about without necessarily fully exempting them. For God forbid, we should have a serious accident to a tourist or a renter because there was no knowledge of the rental, or there's no notice that there was a problem. So, but I think if you want to get to yes, it doesn't have to be a black and white situation. You could meet your concerns on a practical level by writing the legislation different for the different kind of units you have, as opposed to a straight blanket exemption. And that's what I'm asking you guys to do, is to come up with a list of those things, not definitive what the numbers are, but just this is a variable, this is a variable. We can soften it, strengthen it with all these variables, and maybe a negotiation comes to pass that. And I just would ask you to do that, or at least meet before we bring you back next time, which is in 2 weeks, to see if there's any progress. Because I don't want to be dealing with this on January 1st for the first time. And I think I had been told that there was a way to yes, but maybe I was wrong. Yes.
No, I'm happy to help in those discussions as we go forward, Sarah and Josh, if we have some time in the next 2 weeks, because certainly we are capable of solving this problem on behalf of Vermonters.
Senator Rob.
Commissioner, I don't know if all the job descriptions are the same, but I'm still stuck on, trying to build capacity to have 6 people bringing more housing online and not being anywhere near the capacity that you need. I think that's going to make it really challenging, frankly, to put all of these projects together. And I can hear it in your voice, and I understand. I think use us for help in that regard, because that is quite alarming to not have the capacity you need to bring this housing online. I just want to see and discuss more in 2 weeks. I mean, we have low unemployment. If these are really high skilled positions and they're temporary, I think that is challenging for people to think about applying, so I'm not going to, judge something I haven't seen, but I would really like to get a sense of how we might help you fill these positions or change them in some way so that you have the capacity you need.
Here.
Thank you. Yes, it's a one, HR in the state process is a lengthy one, even with approval. And then, positions have a title that is statewide that I think minimum qualifications and work experience sort of harken back to a time when there was a much more competitive job environment, and things have changed. And I can't just waive those requirements for a position that has a statewide classification. And so we're running into that. Each one we're having to do special sort of waivers to reduce, minimum work experience, because we'd be happy to take someone out of school, and those sort of things. And we're getting through it. I don't mean to sound alarmist. I just, there is $818 million of new housing money. And that's what we're trying to move. And it's a lot of work, and that, I'm hesitant to take on anything that is going to distract us from the job one at hand of housing folks that are homeless. And it's every day there's not enough people working on that task. And so that's what you're hearing in my voice and, my sort of defensiveness here. And I'm sorry for that.
Okay, anybody else have any questions?
No, but I think I'll be in touch in the next day or two and see what we can pull together.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Is David Hall there?
Yeah, he is.
David, I know you shared with me your thoughts on the governor's veto message. And am I correct the way phrased generally your opinion that you felt that there were some technical possibilities of what was being mentioned by the governor of happening, but there was never any testimony from fire safety that they were going to do it in that way, nor in the real world with prosecutorial discretion and all that, it never happens that way. And the last thing is, if we needed to fix the language to meet on a technical level, the concerns around complaint-driven and unlimited discretion in terms of penalties, certainly that's what legislative drafting is all about.
Yeah, David Hall, Legislative Counsel. I think it's a fair characterization. I think what's most important to remember about the construct itself is that it just grafted onto the current language that DFS already uses for everything that it does for public buildings, which includes rental properties. And according to their testimony, they already have jurisdiction over roughly 2/3, 3/4 of the issues that arise in this context as it is. So, is it theoretically possible that tomorrow fire safety could switch from a complaint-based system to a rolling inspection system? Yes. That's what their current authority is. And this bill would not have changed that in any way. So, I think, again, your characterization is accurate. Is it theoretically, legally possible that they could move to a system that is different than the complaint-based system everyone has always discussed? Yes, they could move from that system now to some other system. But I also think it's fair to say that in multiple years of testimony, I personally have never heard any representation made that they would use something other than a complaint-based system. And, I can't speak for why anybody voted for or against anything. I can't characterize anybody's intent, specifically, but I can say that in the House Committee of Jurisdiction, around the room, there were people who were concerned on this point. And, I feel like my testimony was faithful, that the law does not require it to be a complaint-based system. But that's what we have now, and that's what everybody has said was going to continue. So I guess to your last point, can it be written so that it is expressly limited to a complaint-based system? Absolutely. Can you modify the penalty and enforcement structure? Of course, absolutely. The bill, the construct is the way that it is because that was the consensus for what it should be. And if it needs to be changed, it can certainly be changed.
And let me just be clear, as I said before, I'm not looking in any way to go backwards on anything. So if fire safety, if we were to say it has to be complaint-based driven and that's as far as it could go, we would only, in my opinion, we would only be changing the law for their expanded jurisdiction. The existing jurisdiction, which hasn't been a problem, should stay the same, where practically it is complaint-based driven, but you're saying theoretically, if they had a reason to go further, they could do that. I don't want to take away that authority, but this is a new, I do, in legislative negotiations, I do hear the other side when they say, well, you're not really changing any of the law from what they do now, you're just expanding their authority. Expanding their authority because they're so much better at what they do than public health safety officers is, in my mind, a good thing. In other people's minds, it's not a good thing, but it is a change. And so I'm not necessarily oblivious or to that concern.
So David, in the House, because obviously, well, I could have watched it, but I haven't. Did the in-house counsel for fire safety actually testify in the House? Because Mike DeRocher was only supportive of this work in our committee.
I don't know who that, I don't know who that person would be, and I personally did not hear testimony from an in-house counsel on their part. I can't say definitively whether or not such a person appeared ever. I don't know the whole schedule, but I didn't see it or hear it, and I never was referred to anyone who was working in that capacity. So
Right.
I only ever heard Mike.
Right, and nor did Mike ever raise these issues. So thank you very much.
Well, to the contrary, he testified repeatedly that they don't have the capacity to have a rolling enforcement system, and it would only be complaint because that's all that they could manage.
Exactly, but yes, right. Supporting the work that we passed.
I think it's also, just important to note that, that the 30 to 40% of the portfolio that does not overlap with fire safety is already subject to the regulatory authority of the Department of Health.
Right.
So
right.
again, there's no change in scope of what your property is subject to. It's just who would be enforcing it.
Exactly.
One last question, David. Is there any way to, by regulation, to clarify this point and to continue to pursue the version that we passed and give some people some comfort by writing a letter or something encouraging the Department of Fire Safety or whatever to do by regulation what we're talking about potentially doing by legislation in a different bill?
I don't think that you can add the 30-40% to their portfolio without a change in statute. And the reason
I was talking about the provision that they can't do a rolling based inspection and that they can't shut down a building for a cracked window.
well, so the way the law is currently written, it says that the department has the authority by regulation or rule to, basically flesh out the standards and enforce the statutes as they're written. And it also says that the division has the authority to basically establish its priorities for how to enforce the rules that they adopt. So I think that the law as written already, yes, gives them the ability through the administrative process to establish what their enforcement priorities are and what their approach is. I don't know for sure. I don't believe that there's any administrative framework that is as definitive as a rule that says right now they only do complaints, but they could adopt that sort of framework if that's what they chose to do.
Thank
By
you.
rule.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Anybody else have any questions? So we're about 20 minutes earlier. Let's take a little walk and we'll